Hello, this is the Provoked Prawn here with my thoughts on the Hyte Y40. I've now built in this case in two different ways, and I want to talk to you about my experiences of doing so and what it's been like to build in, what it's been like to use. I've done some benchmarking and testing with this, and I want to get to that in a little while to show you the thermal performance of it. I want to talk about my experiences with the case and the different layout options that you have. As you can see, I've used these fake Lee & Lee Infinity mirror fans, for example, and I've used a 4090 in there as well as a 4070 Ti, and I've done a lot of different tests and sort of experiments with the case to see how it'd get on with building in it and to look out for issues that you might find along the way if you're considering buying or thinking of building in it, and the things to bear in mind while doing so, because there's some interesting highlights to it. It is, as you can see, quite a nice looking case, especially with the build setup that I've got. Pretty happy with the results of both of these builds. They look good, and you can obviously go for a fairly understated design with less RGB, as I've done here, and I'll leave the specs of both builds in the description, or you can go all in with the RGB. Stripping the case down to almost nothing, removing all the side panels so that you can see inside, there are a few different things that I want to highlight for you before we get started with going into a bit more depth, because some of the things you don't really notice until you start to build, but some are a bit more obvious. There are two fans included as standard, one at the bottom of the case set to intake and one at the rear set as exhaust. You also have options for mounting up to a 360mm radiator on the top and a 280mm radiator on the side. Now, some of the quirks of the case are definitely in the panels. You'll see the top panel pulls off, for example, and there's a mesh dust shield built into the top there. It's not removable, so you'd have to clean that over time. And the same for the rear panel, which, as you can see, has some nice venting on it to allow for good airflow. But again, the dust panel's built into it, so that might be a bit tricky to clean. The other oddity is on the underside, there are two dust shields down here, but they pull off in different directions. So one goes one way and one goes the other way. Imagine this is on your desk. You're going to have to work out how you can get those two out from either side, which I think could be a bit of a pain over time. Obviously, one's shielding the intake fan, the other one's going to be shielding the power supply unit, so they might get dirty, and they're going to be a pain to get to clean out. The other thing you'll see is that we have a vertical GPU mount pre-installed in the case in here, which is a nice addition. So this is the riser cable that you'd need for your graphics card to put it into that vertical GPU mounted position. Now, this case only allows for vertical GPU mounting, and that's from those shots you saw at the beginning. You can only vertically mount your graphics card. You can't put it in the standard position, which is a strange choice. Now, if you're vertical mounting for aesthetics, that's absolutely fine, and I've done some tests a bit later that will show the performance hasn't been too bad with the GPU, and it does look quite nice, and even with the larger graphics cards, it is sitting far enough back from the glass that it doesn't seem to cause issues in terms of thermal performance. The case is also surprisingly spacious considering its size. You see things are jammed in there, but I've managed to fit both the 4070 in there and then this white 4090, which, as you can see, isn't an issue. So it doesn't take up so much room that it's touching the glass in any direction, and because it's vertically mounted, you don't have to worry about the power cables pressing up against the glass either, because they're behind the graphics card, so that's not an issue. You'll notice on the back here that you have markings for the graphics card installation and then expansion slots. It's just a bit of a strange layout. I've never seen a case like this before. You don't have the option to horizontally mount a graphics card in basically the standard position, so it's an odd choice. But that said, you only have one bottom intake fan. You don't have the usual number of fans down the bottom that you would in other cases. Quite often, you might have 2 or 3 fans below the GPU. You don't have that here. You just have this one lonely one down the bottom, which I thought was a bit of an odd choice personally, because it's just stuck down the bottom and then it's blocked by the shroud above it. Now, there are holes in that shroud, so the air can flow through from below, but having just one intake fan made me question the sort of layout logic of what I would be doing and how to get the best performance out of the case. And the other problem you have is if you have a large power supply unit, like this 1500 watt Corsair power supply, then obviously that's going to take up more room, and then the cables for it may well get in the way of the fan as well, whether they're going to accidentally touch that fan or just block the airflow from it, depending on how much you've tucked it in, remains to be seen. Also depends on your cable management skills. Now, in terms of mounting your SSDs and hard disk drives, you're also limited there. There's this removable backplate here, which you can put either 2 SSDs on or 1 hard disk drive, as you can see here. Obviously, you have the option to mount other things to it. I, for example, put a Razer Chroma RGB controller on there in one of the builds, or you can put 2 SSDs on there, but that's it. There are no other storage locations for drives in the system, so you can't put any other drives in any other places unless you just bunged it in the bottom next to the power supply unit. Now, in terms of the power supply, I actually ended up using a Shift PSU for this from Corsair, which I'd suggest is actually a better option for this build and a bit more logical, because you can make sure those cables are away from that fan down the bottom. They also have thin cables included with them, which are pretty flat, and you can use cable ties to tie the cables together to make them even more neat, and you can then just angle them at the right place to tidy things up. Now, there aren't any channels for the cables particularly. There are a few loops in various different spots on the left hand side, so there are only a few points to tie the cables down, which can result in it being a bit of a mess, but I still managed to close the back door. In terms of radiator mounting, I'm putting the Hyte Thick Q60 on the side here, and that is set to intake. So that is one logical way of doing it, I believe, because then you've got an intake fan on the bottom and then 2 intake fans on the radiator. And then I ended up putting some extra fans on the top to match the one at the rear, so we've got a load of exhaust fans as well. In this configuration, as I'll show in a minute, the performance is actually pretty good. The alternative option is to use a 360mm radiator, as I'm doing here on the top, and then I've got 2 intake fans on the side, which are reverse blade fans, and then a single fan at the rear as well. So a bit more in terms of the options, but you are quite limited. There's not much more else you can do with the case, really, unfortunately, because obviously there's no front fans, and you can't really put any more fans down the bottom. So it's a choice of aesthetics or what you're going for here. Obviously, I'm exhausting air through the radiator in this case, whereas with the Hyte cooler, I'm intaking air through the radiator. So if you've got a hot CPU, you might want to go for the second option. But if you have high performance fans, then either might be fine. Another thing to note is you might see that there's a bit of a squeeze at the back with that extra fan as exhaust when you've got a 360mm radiator on top as well. So something to keep in mind. So you can see you've got some nice options here. And even with the thick radiator, there's plenty of space between that and the graphics card. I think if you had a triple slot GPU, it might be a bit more of a problem. But the other thing to bear in mind is the processor you're using and the hardware. So I'm using an i9-14900K in this build. And what I found is that with these cheap fans, which I've done a video on separately, it gets pretty toasty. You're looking at really hot temperatures in there, and the fans ended up being quite loud as well. So I found it was quite loud, and also the temps it was putting out were pretty hot, and ended up being like 40 degrees upwards on top of the case. And because it's metal, you can really feel that heat as well. Now, I did a lot of thermal testing, and I was also fighting problems with the i9, which I've done a separate video on, and you might be aware of anyway, but there's been some stability issues with i9s and various different motherboards. So these tests might be skewed ever so slightly, because when I started off doing them with a 360mm radiator, it was really hot, and I had to do a lot of work to sort it out with the BIOS updates and tweaks in the BIOS. But we ended up getting 100 degrees on some of the performance cores, and in the 90s as well. Even when tweaked, it was still showing some pretty hot temperatures on the high end when benchmarking. And as I said, it does get quite loud. But obviously, you're not going to be usually putting your system under that amount of pressure with stress testing and benchmarking. If you're just gaming, you'll have a much nicer experience. And your experience may vary depending on the fans you're using and the radiator and the CPU. So you have to take these sort of results with a pinch of salt. In the other build, I bought some fans to match the pre-installed exhaust fan to add to the top. I figured that with more exhaust, it might help with the cooling performance here, even if we haven't got loads of intake. So we've got 3 extra FA12 fans mounted to the top of the case, and as an alternative. One of the things you can see here as well is there's a small gap behind the fan where you can see all the top of the motherboard for the cables, which is actually useful for running the cables through and plugging those in during the build process. But there's also going to be some passive exhaust from the top of the motherboard in this way as well, so it benefits in 2 ways, but I was trying to make the aesthetic kind of similar. Alternatively, you could get some of the radiator fans and purchase them separately to maintain the same sort of aesthetic throughout. With the RGB strips, which won't be for everybody, you can see that you've got a nice glow through the glass as well. Despite the slight tinting to it, you can still see everything inside quite nicely, and the end result of that looks pretty nice, and quite happy with how it's come out, although it's not going to be for everybody. You might want more RGB, you might want less, but you do have options inside here and plenty of space for all of these components as well. ATX motherboard, large chunky AIO, and a large GPU. I ran some thermal tests and stress tests with this setup as well, so you can see the difference between them, and you'll see with Intel stress testing tool and 20 minutes of load, we're not getting as high in the top end of the CPU in terms of the overall temps of the performance cores. With Cinebench, one of the cores got up to 100 degrees, but the rest are equally not as high as they were in the previous build as well. So there's definitely some benefit to building this way with an intake radiator and those extra exhaust fans. Seems to have performed pretty well across the board there, as well as in 3D Mark stress testing. I found it ran quieter as well. Now, that's not to say it'll be perfect for everybody, because you might find, for example, as I said in the other build, if you had better quality fans, because those were very cheap fans, you might get better performance out of it. But I have found that it does run quietly with this setup, so you do get what you pay for. I thought it would be worth just using the smoke machine to try and demonstrate some of the airflow as well. So you can see with the smoke blowing underneath, it is actually being pulled through that plastic shroud, so the fan at the bottom is doing its job. You are seeing some of the air flowing through the inside of the glass, and it comes up interestingly right up against the glass, so it would be going where the graphics card fans would be, so they'll be pulling the air through there as well. So although there's no intake on the front, you do have it on the rear and on the bottom, and it seems to flow quite nicely through it. That said, it's still hotter than other cases I've seen where you do have the option of front fans, so it's something to keep in mind. But overall, it's a pretty nice case, I think. It's got a good build quality to it, feels nice and solid, apart from when you've taken all the glass out, but generally, once you've built it, it feels nice and sturdy. It's got a good build quality to it. There are just a few complaints I had about, for example, lack of storage options, the thought of that bottom fan and the way it's blocked, and the potential issues you might have with the power supply cables. But it's a nice looking case. Obviously, this is the red and black version. You can get it in other colors as well. It's potential options. So there's plenty of different choices out there for your own aesthetics and building a PC that you're going to enjoy. I've already had a comment saying this is the ugliest PC I've built. So it's obviously not for everybody. But hopefully you found this video useful. If you have, subscribe. And if you haven't, thanks for watching anyway. And let me know down below what you think of the build. You've made it right to the end of the video, you brilliant legend you. If you've enjoyed it, click that subscribe button, give me a thumbs up, and drop me a comment down below if you've got any questions. If you really enjoyed it, consider joining the channel and see the benefits of doing so. Check out these other videos, you might well find them interesting or useful, and most importantly, have a great life.